I want to show you this map of the 54 countries that participated in a secret CIA program to abduct people from all around the world and hide them so that they could secretly interrogate them using violence, both physical and psychological. This story begins 6 days after 9/11, when George W. Bush signs a memo giving the CIA free rein to secretly capture and detain suspected terrorists. But the question became what to do with these suspects once they were captured. Putting them in prison in the US would be problematic because it would mean that the US would have to follow the rules of war, which entails declaring them as prisoners of war and giving them access to a lawyer and a trial. And crucially, no torture allowed. Those are the rules that most of the world has agreed upon. And the CIA didn't want to play by these rules. The country was raging with anger and a thirst for revenge against those who did this. For the CIA, the rules would just slow them down in their hunt for the intelligence they needed to not only find the terrorists, but to stop future attacks. So the CIA looked abroad and began constructing a global network of secret prisons that would allow them to abduct and detain people outside of the view of the public, the press, and the law. The first target was a Palestinian citizen named Abu Zubaydah. He was hiding in Pakistan, and the CIA believed that he was a top al-Qaeda leader. In March 2002, CIA and FBI forces capture him in a raid in Pakistan. Zubaydah was shot in this raid and almost didn't survive. So the CIA flew in a doctor from a top US hospital to treat his wounds. They needed to keep him alive so that they could extract intelligence from him, vital knowledge that the CIA wanted. But where to take him? The CIA had decided on Thailand, where they had worked out a deal with the Thai government, where the CIA could use this old US military base for whatever they were up to here. This facility became known as Detention Site Green. And the plan was to get Zubaydah to talk using, quote, novel interrogation methods, meaning they were planning on using torture. But there was yet another problem: the law. Capturing people in someone else's country and then sending them to a third country without any plan to give them a trial or apply local laws, and then using torture, is all illegal, according to both international and American laws. So one key step in this effort was to ask the government lawyers back in Washington to create a legal justification for what they were about to do. And the lawyers did exactly what they were told. They drafted up a series of memos that argued that al-Qaeda members were not typical soldiers. Instead, they would be considered, quote, unlawful enemy combatants. So according to the legal theory in this memo, which was meant to remain secret, the rules don't apply here. So the CIA got their legal justification. But even still, the CIA agents in Thailand needed to make sure that none of this would get out. They send this cable back to Washington, D.C., asking for, quote, assurance that Abu Zubaydah would remain in isolation and incommunicado for the remainder of his life. And here we see in a cable from Washington that they gave these agents that assurance. Before I go on, let me note that I will not be going into detail about the interrogation techniques used by the CIA. I think that is well covered elsewhere. So instead, I will be using sterile words like enhanced interrogation, partly because I'm publishing this to a lot of people and I want to make sure that this video remains accessible to a large audience, including younger viewers, and partly to spare all of you of these details. I believe that the story can be well understood without those details. If you do want more information on this, go to the sources in my description where all of this is documented. Okay, so the CIA has their first secret prison and it's in Thailand. And Abu Zubaydah secretly remains there for 9 months, during which the CIA uses its expanded authority to torture this man to get information that they think will help them catch more terrorists. But here comes another problem for the CIA. The Thai government officials are starting to learn more about the secret program and are becoming uncomfortable with the CIA doing this in their country. Not to mention, the media starts poking around and learning more details about what the CIA is up to. So much so that Vice President Dick Cheney himself tries to convince an American news outlet not to publish any of the details. They partly comply, but the whole thing spooks the CIA. They realize that they need to leave Thailand. This is the CIA moving its secret prisoners from Thailand to another location, but they would have to cover their tracks. And that's how we get this document. We're looking at a receipt for the booking of a private jet through a contractor working with the CIA. We see that they booked a Gulfstream 4 to go from DC to Thailand. This is where they loaded up Abu Zubaydah and a few other secret prisoners. They then fly to the United Arab Emirates. And here's where things get interesting, because from there, the official flight records say that this plane went to Austria and then London, but it actually didn't. This is a dummy flight record that the CIA planted so that we would never know what they actually did. But because of this receipt, we know that they actually flew to a small airport in rural Poland. The CIA then drives their prisoners 20 minutes from this little airport to a military prison in the woods. The CIA had paid the Polish intelligence agency $15 million of cash, delivered in cardboard boxes, all in exchange for the use of this facility, their second secret terrorist torture prison, or what we're now going to call Black Site. This one was called Detention Site Blue. This is where they would continue their interrogation work, continuing to abduct suspected terrorists and quietly bringing them here, often scrambling their flight paths and faking their flight records so that this story could never be told, and continuing to use violent torture to interrogate their prisoners. But again, this couldn't last too long. After a year, they were on the move again, worried that the world was catching on. So in September 2003, and here comes another series of flight paths, from Washington, D.C., bouncing around a few countries before ending up in Poland, where they loaded up their secret prisoners once again and took off. Headed to Romania, where the CIA had negotiated access to the basement of a government building in September 2003, their next black site. And then to Morocco, where the CIA was negotiating with the government for another black site. They ended up paying $20 million to build a prison that was codenamed Bombay. But in the end, they never used it, instead using Morocco's local prisons to house their prisoners for a short time. And then over to Cuba, to the US naval base at Guantanamo Bay, where they opened two black sites, Detention Site Maroon and Indigo. These sites were kept separate from the military prison at Guantanamo Bay. And honestly, not much is known about them. In fact, they're only mentioned one time and in a footnote in this Senate report that eventually came out. Look at this map. This is one way to visualize the global network that the CIA created. These are the known flight paths that the CIA took to transfer prisoners around their black sites. By 2004, they had captured about 100 prisoners, consistently moving them around, hoping to stay out of the light, out of the scrutiny of the public, the press, and oftentimes the home governments of these places where they were moving their prisoners. And by the way, all of this data, these flight paths, this information, we know about because of an investigation and a Senate report that later came out, and some amazing investigative journalism by the Rendition Project, who boiled a lot of this down, pieced together a lot of the information, and allowed us to see this in an accessible way. You can find so much more detail at the Rendition Project website if you want to check that out. Let's look at this network again. The CIA using 54 countries to traffic their secret flights through to cover their tracks from the law and the press. This reportedly includes a little-known British territory in the Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia. And in the end, the CIA had a total of 9 secret prisons, at least that we know of. The network included another Eastern European country, a prison in Lithuania, where the CIA used a shell company to purchase this nondescript barn that had been an elite horse riding club. It was called Detention Site Violet. They ran 4 of these secret prisons in Afghanistan, including one that was nicknamed Dark Prison because prisoners were held in metal shipping containers in complete darkness and isolation, sometimes with loud music playing to keep them awake, among other horrific treatment. The CIA would also work with countries like Jordan and Egypt, where their intelligence officers would use torture, but the CIA agent would be right there guiding the whole thing. And there's evidence that the CIA also turned ships into black sites, floating prisons where they could interrogate their prisoners on international water. Hey, before we go on, I want to explain a little bit more about the methodology of how we report on stories like this. This process takes weeks or months sometimes. It's a lot of research, a lot of reporting, and a tool we've been using a lot lately is Ground News, who is the sponsor of today's video. Ground News is a website and an app that aggregates over 50,000 news sources into one place and condenses them down into one story, giving you way more information about that story. So something we've been researching a lot lately is the South China Sea. If you type that into Ground News, you can see this story about a legal dispute between China and the Philippines. Easily my favorite feature about Ground News is this ability to compare the different news outlets that are covering this story from around the whole world. For example, the South China Morning Post out of Hong Kong says that China maps out claims to shoal amid dispute with Philippines, while a source from the Philippines says China opposes new Philippine maritime law. These are subtle differences in these headlines, but as you dive deeper into these articles, you can learn a lot about each country's perspective. Ground News has definitely helped me understand a story better by seeing the competing narratives and angles that different outlets use to cover that story. So if you're somebody who values critical thinking and trying to make sense of the many stories coming out of the world today, this might be a good tool for you. And lucky for you, they're giving viewers of my channel 50% off the Vantage plan, which includes all of the features I talked about and a bunch of other really useful tools. All in, it works out to be less than $5 a month, which for good analysis and news is pretty cheap. This discount is their biggest sale of the year and it won't last forever, so go check it out. The link is in my description. It is ground.news/Johnny Harris, or you can just use this fancy QR code that's on screen. Boy, isn't that helpful. Thank you, Ground News, for existing at a time of disinformation and global confusion. And thanks for sponsoring today's video. With that, let's get back to the story of CIA black sites. All in all, the CIA ended up interrogating 119 prisoners using this network of black sites. And of the 119, they ended up releasing 94 of them. Some were sent to foreign custody, some were just released, and some have a status that is still unknown. And some turned out to be totally innocent, like Maher Arar, who was a Canadian-Syrian dual citizen, who was taken by the CIA in an airport in New York on his way back home to Canada. Then he was transferred to Syria and tortured for a year before the CIA realized that he was the wrong guy. The Canadian government ended up paying him $10 million for his troubles. One guy named Gul Rahman died of hypothermia at a black site in Afghanistan while he was chained naked to a concrete floor. No CIA officers were punished. One German citizen was held and interrogated in a hotel room in Macedonia for 23 days before being flown to Afghanistan and imprisoned for 4 months. Before the CIA realized that, once again, he was the wrong guy, he was released with a meager apology and a small payment. But then there's prisoners like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who most people consider the mastermind of 9/11, the guy who planned it. Or Abd al-Nashiri, who's charged with planning the bombing of an American Navy ship just before 9/11, the USS Cole. Or this guy, Hambali, who's known as the Osama bin Laden of Southeast Asia. Like, these are guys who need to face justice. They are most likely responsible for the gruesome murder of thousands of innocent people. And in a post-9/11 America, there was so much anger and need for revenge. The idea was that torture was totally justified, especially if it stopped another attack. But what's really happening here with this massive network of secret prisons and this enhanced interrogation is that the CIA is falling into Al-Qaeda's trap. And internally, you start to see how people in the CIA know that this is actually a bad idea. Many stopped wanting to participate in the enhanced interrogation. Some were brought to tears while witnessing it. One memo shows how the CIA started sending their worst people to do these interrogations, leading to mediocre or useless intelligence. And while all of this was secretly happening, President Bush was publicly saying,
I want to be absolutely clear with our people and the world. The United States does not torture. It's against our laws and it's against our values. I have not authorized it and I will not authorize it.
But eventually the world would catch on. The Washington Post was one of the first to report on this in detail. And then a former CIA chief of counterterrorism in Pakistan, the one who directed a lot of the raids to capture these prisoners, went public, telling a journalist that the CIA had been waterboarding prisoners, a torturous technique that induces the sensation of drowning over and over.
Feet at a slight incline, there's some cellophane or material over your mouth, and then they pour water on this cellophane. You can't breathe, and it feels like the water's going down your throat.
But you might be thinking that if we're talking about terrorists, people who have committed heinous atrocities against innocent people, that the normal rules and values that we abide by don't apply here, especially if these techniques could potentially give us information that would thwart the next horrific attack and save thousands of lives. In that case, isn't torture justified? Well, it turns out that in addition to being a violation of our own values, torture doesn't actually work. There's been extensive research on this that finds that despite what the movies say, torture doesn't work. It creates stress, making it harder for the person being interrogated to remember facts, and often pushes them to make up information to get the torture to stop. There are many cases of this happening within the CIA Black Site program. Like when the mastermind of 9/11 was being waterboarded hundreds of times, he finally gave the names of two men who the CIA spent a bunch of time going to capture only to learn that they had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda or terrorism. It's just not as straightforward as you would imagine. But the CIA disagrees. They said that they got useful intelligence on this. So the Senate, when they were investigating this program, went case by case to actually evaluate whether or not torture led to useful intelligence, ones that thwarted the terrorists' plans. And what they found was that there was, quote, no relationship between the information from torture and thwarting these plots and stopping the next terror attack. They found that the CIA did get useful intelligence from these prisoners, but not from torture, and that they often tried to retroactively justify the torture by saying that useful intelligence did come out of the program. But most of the time, that information was gained from other sources, or it was information that the government already had. And even worse, they found that the CIA never actually did an evaluation on how useful these techniques were. They just kind of did them, evading any kind of accountability and oversight that would make this not only ethical and legal, but also effective in getting the intelligence they were after. Overall, the conclusion of this report is that, quote, the CIA's use of its enhanced interrogation techniques was not an effective means of acquiring intelligence or gaining cooperation from detainees. So they shut the program down, and of the 119 men who went through these black sites, 21 of them remain in the custody of the United States government at the military base in Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. But of all of these people, only 3 of them have faced any version of a trial of justice where evidence is presented and a verdict is given. And this gets to what to me is the worst outcome of this torture program, which is that it turned into a massive success for the terrorists who attacked Washington, D.C. and New York on that day. Al-Qaeda successfully provoked the United States and the CIA to lash out in revenge, to violate their own norms and values, the ones that they preach to the rest of the world, to lay bare the hypocrisy of the United States, which is something that a lot of the world already has a problem with. The view that the US is a hypocritical empire, eager to preach about human rights and rule of law, but quick to violate those very values when they become inconvenient. And in the process, not only did the CIA fail to get any useful intelligence out of this, but they also turned these men into victims. Like the guy who probably planned the USS Cole bombing that killed dozens of US sailors, that guy should face justice. He should sit in a courtroom and have his crimes proved to the public, and he should be punished at a measure that is proportional to his crime. However, due to the CIA's use of brutal and illegal torture, his case has been totally tainted. The evidence obtained in his interrogation is now inadmissible in court. He's even been granted victim status in the European Court of Human Rights for the torture he endured in Poland, forcing Poland to pay him 100,000 euros. And so now the families of those who died in that horrific bombing have no closure. The person who did this will never be brought to justice. And this goes for so many of the men who plotted and executed the 9/11 attacks. If you go to their Wikipedia page, you're going to see a lot about what the CIA did to them, the black site program that they were a part of. The reason why I call it a trap is because the CIA, in doing what they did, helped turn these men into symbols of American hypocrisy, whereas they should be seen as symbols of terror. When we stoop to the level of revenge, the most primitive form of justice, we go backwards. We erode the foundations of our system, what we've built. And then, of course, our government and our press has to spend years or decades picking up the pieces, shining a light on all of it, making sure we stand accountable, and that hopefully we learn from our mistakes.